For most of her adult life, Mara Ellison had been the family member everyone described with a shrug. The daughter who supposedly moved from one ordinary job to another, never stayed anywhere long, and had somehow made a habit of disappearing whenever the family needed someone to explain what she actually did for a living. What none of them knew was that Mara had spent the previous 15 years working in military emergency response, specializing in recovering dangerous equipment from disaster zones, and that the quiet woman who now drove an aging blue sedan through the mountain town of Bellhaven, Colorado, had returned home carrying memories she had never been allowed to put into words. She came back 5 days before her sister Tessa's engagement celebration, not because she expected an apology or recognition, but because her father had undergone surgery and the family had insisted she attend. So Mara parked beside the old farmhouse, carried her single suitcase upstairs, and prepared herself for another week of pretending that the past had never happened. The family gathering began exactly as Mara expected, with cousins filling the kitchen, relatives arguing about decorations, and her mother proudly explaining every tiny detail of Tessa's upcoming ceremony, while barely acknowledging that Mara had arrived after driving nearly 12 hours through freezing rain. When Tessa's fiancé, Grant, jokingly asked whether Mara was still between jobs, several people laughed, and Mara simply smiled before carrying another tray of food into the dining room, because after years of being misunderstood, she had learned that correcting people was sometimes more exhausting than allowing them to remain comfortably wrong. Later that evening, her younger brother Nolan complained that Mara had never accomplished anything impressive, saying that everyone else had built careers, bought homes, or started families while she had apparently spent her life chasing temporary work. And Mara looked at him for several seconds before quietly answering, "Maybe you should be careful about judging a life from the pieces someone chooses to show you." The first crack in the family's version of Mara's life appeared the following morning when an unexpected visitor arrived at the farmhouse, a retired military officer named Daniel Rourke, who had come to deliver a sealed envelope that Mara had been expecting for nearly 3 months. Daniel greeted her with an unusual seriousness, then noticed her parents watching from the porch and immediately understood why she had never told them everything. So instead of explaining himself, he handed Mara the envelope and said, "You still have people who remember what you did in Candar Ridge." Mara's expression changed for only a moment, but her mother noticed, and when she asked what Candar Ridge was, Mara folded the envelope into her jacket and replied, "A place I would rather leave behind," before Daniel quietly added, "Some places don't let people leave them completely." That afternoon, Mara accompanied Tessa to a renovated hotel where the engagement party was being prepared. And while everyone else debated table arrangements, she noticed a maintenance worker struggling with an electrical cabinet that had begun sparking behind a decorative wall. Before anyone could react, Mara recognized the warning signs, ordered everyone away from the area, shut down the correct circuit, and prevented a small electrical fault from becoming something far more serious, leaving the hotel manager staring at her in disbelief. Grant laughed nervously and asked how someone with temporary jobs knew enough to handle something like that. But before Mara could answer, Daniel's former colleague, who happened to be working security at the hotel, stepped forward and said, "Because she wasn't a temporary anything." And the room suddenly became quiet enough for Mara to hear the rain striking the windows. That night, her father found an old photograph inside a box that Mara had accidentally left open in the hallway, and the image showed her wearing a protective uniform beside a damaged emergency vehicle, surrounded by several people whose faces had been blurred for security reasons. On the back, there was only a date and one handwritten sentence that read, "She brought 12 people home when everyone else thought the road was lost." And her father stood frozen until Mara gently took the photograph from his hands and said, "I never wanted you to know the worst parts, because knowing would have made you carry them too." Her father stared at her with tears gathering in his eyes and asked why she had never told the family about her work, and Mara answered that whenever she tried to talk about it in the past, they had already decided what her life meant. So eventually she stopped trying to convince people who seemed happier believing she had failed. The next morning, Mara finally opened Daniel's envelope, discovering that it contained a letter confirming that she had been selected for a national commendation for an operation she had never publicly discussed. Years earlier, during a humanitarian evacuation in a remote region, Mara had discovered that a convoy route was compromised and stayed behind long enough to guide a group of stranded civilians through an alternate passage, while communications failed and danger closed in from both sides. And although several people credited the operation to a larger team, Daniel's letter made it clear that Mara's decisions had prevented the convoy from entering a deadly trap. She read the letter alone at the kitchen table, folded it carefully, and placed it beside her coffee. But Tessa had been standing in the doorway and heard enough to realize that the sister she had spent years teasing was not the person she thought she knew. Tessa confronted Nolan before breakfast, accusing him of treating Mara like a failure simply because Mara had never advertised her accomplishments. And Nolan became defensive until their mother interrupted and admitted something even more painful. Mara had quietly been sending money home for years whenever the family struggled, paying overdue medical bills, helping repair the farmhouse roof, and covering expenses that everyone had assumed came from their parents' savings. The room went silent when their father revealed that he had recently discovered the payments had come from an account connected to Mara. And when Nolan asked why she had never mentioned any of it, Mara finally said, "Because helping you wasn't supposed to become a scoreboard," leaving her brother with no clever response and forcing the entire family to confront how little they had actually known about the person they had judged so easily. Tessa's celebration was supposed to be the happiest event of the week. Yet Mara nearly left before it began when she overheard two relatives joking that her sudden importance was probably exaggerated, and that military stories always sounded bigger when someone wanted attention. Instead of arguing, Mara stepped outside into the cold and found Daniel waiting beside the garden wall, where he reminded her that courage did not require an audience, and that she had already spent years proving herself to people who were never there when the difficult decisions had to be made. Mara smiled faintly and said, "I don't need them to believe every story." And Daniel replied, "No, but you deserve to stop living as though your truth is something you have to apologize for." During the celebration, Tessa surprised everyone by refusing to make Mara the center of attention, explaining that she did not want a dramatic speech or public revelation, because her sister had spent too many years having her life reduced to rumors. Instead, Tessa simply placed a small handwritten note beside Mara's seat that said, "You never had to earn your place here." And for the first time in years, Mara allowed herself to cry without turning away. Nolan approached her afterward and admitted that he had confused silence with failure because he had been too insecure to imagine that his sister might have accomplished things he could not understand. And Mara told him, "You don't have to make yourself feel guilty forever, but you do have to decide what kind of brother you want to be from this moment forward." The following morning brought one final surprise when the mayor of Bellhaven arrived at the farmhouse with several community leaders, not to celebrate Mara's military record, but to ask for her help with a volunteer emergency training program that she had quietly supported for years. Mara initially refused because she had no interest in becoming a local celebrity, but when she saw teenagers learning how to respond during floods, fires, and roadside accidents, she agreed on one condition. Nobody would use her history as publicity, and the program would focus on teaching ordinary people how to stay calm when everything around them became chaotic. Her father watched her organize the first training session from the porch, and when he finally approached her, he said, "I spent years telling people my daughter was trying to find herself," before pausing and adding, "I never realized she had been helping everyone else find their way home." At sunset, Mara sat alone on the farmhouse steps with her sleeves rolled above her wrists, revealing an old scar that she had spent years hiding beneath watches, jackets, and careful explanations. Tessa joined her without asking questions, placed 2 cups of tea on the step, and simply sat beside her while the sounds of the town drifted through the evening air. And Mara realized that healing did not always arrive through dramatic apologies or perfect explanations, because sometimes it came quietly when the people who once misunderstood you finally stopped demanding a version of your life that made them comfortable. When Mara left Bellhaven the next morning, She carried the same small suitcase she had arrived with, but she no longer felt the need to hide behind the phrase, temporary work. Because her family's opinion had finally become what it should have been all along, not the measurement of her worth, but merely one small part of a life she had already built for herself. Please subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends and family. We create entertaining and inspiring stories for our viewers, and your support helps us continue making great content for you.